Our guest on This is America and the World is Becky Pringle, president of the National Education Association. She formerly served as NEA's vice president and as secretary-treasurer. President Pringle went to public school herself and is a 31-year teaching veteran as a middle school science teacher in Pennsylvania. President Pringle, good to be with you this afternoon.
It's good to join you, Dennis.
Over your shoulder, her story is our story. What's that all about?
Oh my goodness. Boy, that question could bring me to tears. I've been on this earth a minute, and to see the first Black woman nominated and then to actually have her confirmed as the next Supreme Court Justice is quite extraordinary. I'm sure you know that her story, and it's why we here at the NEA, as we talked with our members all over the country, we said her story is your story. Her story is certainly my story of perseverance and challenges and excellence and continuous hard work with her goal in mind, centered in her purpose, and she did not give up. It was It was quite amazing to see what she endured during her confirmation hearing, but it said everything about this brilliant jurist who will absolutely reflect the values of this country and ensure justice for every American.
When you were watching those hearings, and they were vicious, they were rough, they were disrespectful, what feelings were going on inside of you?
I will tell you honestly, Dennis, the attacks that were just unrelenting, honestly, were not only disrespectful, but as a woman, as a Black woman, I know that so many of the things that were said to her and the false accusations and taking out of context decisions and the scrutiny of this jurist who had spent her life upholding the greatest tenets of the law and the Constitution. It was hard to watch. It really was. But she endured it, and if you watched any of it, you saw her with tears in her eyes, and I had that tears in my eyes when she said it. When she was asked the question, what advice would she give to somebody else in her position? And she said, just persevere. And that's what she did with such grace and brilliance and such encouragement to everyone, every child watching, every adult thinking about what she will bring to that court. Even though it was hard to watch, Dennis, it showed us what courage and bravery, preparation did to prepare her for that moment.
Let's go a little deeper. You're Black, I'm white. What should white folks know? What are we missing?
One of the things that resonates for me when I talk about Judge Jackson, when I say her story is my story, and as I talk to educators all over this country, whether they are women or men, Black, white, Asian American, Indigenous, Hispanic, her story is our story, because we understand the importance of public education. You know, Dennis, both of her parents were public educators, which brings a smile to my face to know that that was the training that she was brought up under, were public educators, public school educators. But when I think about what white people need to spend a little more time in doing, is building their racial justice muscle. They need to listen to her story. They need to listen to my story. They need to listen to the stories of our young Black boys and girls, our LGBTQ plus students. They need to listen to the stories that make up the fabric of this country. They need to ask questions. They need to read. They need to engage in difficult conversations, because that is how we have the discussions that everyone in this country needs to have in this moment. It is 2022, and we have yet to completely wrestle with the complete history of America and be honest with ourselves in a way that will actually allow us to create that space for our students to be the leaders of a just society.
You know, it's impossible to teach American history without talking about slavery, huh? Without talking about the injustice over hundreds of years. When this whole business of critical race theory comes into play, and you know it's going to play in 2022 in the election, what do you think? What do you say?
You know, Dennis, my dad was a history teacher. I taught science for over 30 years. I didn't care much for history, but you know, he was my dad. So I was going to sit down and I was going to learn a little more history when I came home from school, because of course I wasn't being taught Black history in school. And he wanted to make sure that I understood that when we talked about the Civil War, Reconstruction, when we talked about Jim Crow, that I understood what led to those realities for so many Black people across this country. And he wanted me to understand the journey of Native Americans and study internment in this country of Japanese Americans. He wanted to make sure that I understood how important language was to culture and to people and their history. And so it wasn't only about my history, it was about all of the history, not some that was in textbooks and some that was not. And so when we talk about honesty in education, it really is about that complete history of this country, the times when we lived up to our promise and the times when we did not. We have to talk about all of that. And by the way, our kids are asking for that. You know, we hide behind, oh, with kids are too young and can't talk about that with it. No, they have to be critical thinkers. They have to be those problem solvers so that we can finally live into our promise as a country. And so for me, it is about education. Everything. When I talk about racial justice, I'm talking about education justice. When I talk about social justice, I'm talking about education justice. So when we think about the impact of those thinly veiled efforts to take our attention away from what we need to ensure every student in this country has, so that they can have the opportunity, access to resources to live into their brilliance, that's the conversation I want to have every single day. And it's the conversation all of us must have.
Thank you so much for your honesty and putting that on the table. Let's take a little break talking with Becky Pringle. She is the president of the National Education Association. This is America and the World. This is America and the World is made possible by the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., the Republic of Uzbekistan, the Sultanate of Oman, the Kingdom of Morocco, 21st Century Citizenship, the Frank Islam and Debbie Dreisman Foundation, the Forerunner Foundation, the Rotendaro Family Trust, and the Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy. President Pringle, let's talk a little bit about the NEA. And thank you for that opening section that we talked about and went deeper than both of us had thought we would go. How many members? What's the mission?
So we have 3 million members. The National Education Association represents teachers and nurses and counselors and custodians and bus drivers and paraprofessionals, higher education faculty all over this country and around the world. By the way, Dennis, we represent the educators who educate the children of our armed services, armed service members who serve all over the world. And so we have members all over the world.
So what would you say is the mission or the goal of the NEA?
You know, Dennis, when I took office 2 years ago, in the middle of a pandemic,
Yes, yes,
ooh, that's a whole show.
yeah, yeah.
What I said to my members and our partners at the NEA, and anyone that would sit still long enough to hear me, I laid out a vision for them. And what I said is that the focus for us, for our organization, would be to not only unite our members, but this entire nation, to lead a movement to reclaim public education as a common good, and then transform it into something it actually was never designed to be: a racially and socially just and equitable system that prepares every student, everyone, to succeed in a diverse and interdependent world. And so our focus is on making sure that all students, all of them, excel, and everyone knows it. All educators excel, and everyone knows it. All schools are excelling, and everyone knows it. And we are collectively sharing that responsibility to surround that whole student with all of the resources they need so they come to school prepared to learn every day.
You spent a chunk of time in the classroom.
I did, a chunk, with middle level learners, those babies with attitude, Dennis.
So when you're at an NEA event and the teachers come up to you and whisper in your ear, what are they dealing with? What's the fallout from the pandemic for, let's put it this way, for both the teachers and the students? Big fallout, huh?
So let me start by saying that the well-being of our students is directly connected to the well-being of our educators. We know they are surrounding them with supports. We know they have forever stood in the gaps for students. All of us, everyone knows the story of teachers taking money out of their own pocket, sometimes money they don't have, to fill in those gaps. That's something we all know. It's not okay, but that's been my life as a teacher for sure. And I think I speak for all. But then the pandemic. This wasn't new for us. We knew the inequities that were built into not only the education system, Dennis, but all of those interacting systems. So I often talk about structural racism because it's not only with the education system that we're talking about the housing system and the economic system, we're talking about food insecurity, we're talking about healthcare system. All of those systems determine whether a student has what they need to learn and grow and thrive. And so when the pandemic hit, we were not surprised. We had been fighting for, NEA had just convened, ironically, a group of over 60 organizations to come together in February of 2020 to talk about what we called at the time the homework gap, because too many of our students were going home and they didn't have internet access, so they didn't have the digital tools at home. So we're fighting to get the funding and resources from the federal government. And then in a month we were out, and it wasn't about a homework gap now. It was about whether or not they could continue to learn. And of course, too many of our Black, Brown, and Indigenous students did not, and their families did not have those tools at home. And so we fought hard to make sure that we got federal funding through initially the CARES Act, but most especially the American Rescue Plan money to begin to close those gaps for our students. And so we have educators all over this country, as I traveled around, talking about the reality of them having to take on even more of those gaps, step into those spaces and take meals to families and be that mental health professional, which they weren't trained to do, take on other jobs that then overwhelmed them, which meant their well-being was impacted and our students' well-being was impacted.
Here's a tough kind of question to ask, but online learning during the pandemic, success, failure. I know two kids, one caught it and did well, the other lost a lot of education. How do you size it up from your point of view? What do the teachers say? What do you say?
So we know that we have far too many students who represent that the latter example that you gave, Dennis, where because they just didn't have access. They didn't even have access to online learning.
Right.
And then, of course, we know that students have different learning styles. And so when we think about the academic learning of our students, one of the things that we have been fighting over the last 2 years, we've actually been fighting for this for 10 years, but over the last 2 years, because everyone was seeing into our classrooms and realizing, oh my goodness, they were right. We need to be talking about social and emotional learning as we interconnected, because it interfaces with academic learning. And so for those students who struggled, even if they did have access to digital tools, we know that in-person one-to-one education is what they need. And that's why we fought so hard to make sure we had the resources and the safety in place so that we could bring our students back to in-person learning. But it really did vary. My grandson, he's 10 years old, he spent his third grade year with me learning online. And he did a great job. And his cousin did not do as well. Yeah. So it did depend on the student, but by and large, we know that the best place for our students to be and educators to be is in-person learning and growing together.
How many students are in public education? Is there any number that you can?
We have over 60 million students. And one of the things that a lot of people don't know, Dennis, is that just about 90% of the students in this country go to public schools. It's one of the reasons why I talked about reclaiming public education as not only a common good, but as the foundation of this country, because we have to make sure that free public quality education is available to all students. Over 80% of the richest people in this country send their students, their children, to public schools because our public schools are incredible. The reality is that we have far too many marginalized communities, therefore marginalized schools that have never had the adequate, equitable, and sustained education funding they need to ensure that their students have access to AP courses, to gym, to art, to science equipment and labs, all of those things that the best public schools in this country have access to. And that's what we're fighting for all of our students.
So let's go back. The number of kids in public education is again?
Over 60 million.
60 million. Of that number, what percentage, or can you put a number on kids who might be from areas of poverty, youngsters of color, from dysfunctional families? Is there any way to come up with a number there? Is it?
We don't track dysfunctional families. I'll say that, but we do. I believe maybe it was about 4 years ago, Dennis, is when within our public school system, the majority of our students were students of color. So that was about 4 years ago when that changed. Of course, that varies from area to area. It depends on where you are, what that number actually is. We also track not literally poverty, but what we track is the number of students who receive free and reduced lunch. And again, that number has increased over the years, and we know that in those areas, in the rural areas, which you don't hear a lot of people talk about, but in our rural areas in this country, which includes white students and indigenous students in particular, we have in the Delta a lot of Black students in the Mississippi Delta. But in rural areas, we see a lot of students, a high percentage of students in excess of 50%, usually in excess of 80%, who are coming to school who qualify for free and reduced lunch. That means that their parents are living below the poverty line. And we, as schools, we step in to ensure that our students have the meals that they need to learn.
2022 election is already, the 2022 election, education is already front and center. What do you think are the three main issues that you're going to be speaking about during this coming year?
Well, education should be the main issue. And as I talk to anyone and everyone who is considering running for office or considering being appointed to any kind of position of power and authority within the education system, or in any of those systems that impact education, that they should be talking about education and the reality that as a society, we have never lived up to that promise for every single student. So we should be talking about sustained equitable funding for all of our public schools. We should be talking about safe and just schools throughout this country. We should be talking about social and emotional and academic learning for all of our students. We know that so many of our students, Dennis, and everyone knows that so many of our students came back to in-person learning with a lot of trauma. So many of them lost family members. Some of them lost both of their parents. Some of their parents lost jobs. It was traumatic for our students throughout the pandemic, even those that didn't have those acute losses. It's been a very difficult period of time. And so one of the things that we have fought hard for is ensuring that we have funding to address the mental health needs of our of our students. And while we're talking about that, we need to address the wellness of our educators too, because we are in a severe crisis of educator shortage right now. And it's going in the wrong direction. More and more educators are making the choice to leave the profession. Fewer are going into the profession. And this is a crisis that this country must take on.
How do you go about attracting more teachers, more educators?
Well, we actually did a survey, Dennis, and I honestly have been traveling all over the country on what I call my Joy, Justice, and Excellence tour. Whenever two or more educators are gathered together, and I ask them what they're most proud of, even when I couldn't see their smile beneath their mask, I could see it in their eyes. And they would always talk about the hope and the promise and what they were so excited to do with their students and their parents. And so I learned a lot about what they were doing. I will tell you that they have talked a lot about the reality that to attract and retain educators, and especially educators of color, that's something we at the NEA are working on as well, that we've got to address the fact that we have never paid educators a professional salary. We never have. It doesn't reflect in any way the important work that they do for this country. So there's that. The other thing that they said to us, as we looked at 55% of them saying that they were planning to leave the profession earlier than they thought they would, retiring early. We have young teachers who are leaving. We have teachers in the middle of their career who are leaving. The second thing they told us was that they need more of them. They need more counselors and nurses and mental health professionals, more paraprofessionals, so that they are able to give that one-on-one attention. And then the third thing they told us was that we got to address the mental health of students. And that's not new, Dennis, but the pandemic made it worse. All of societal challenges and ills find their way to our schoolhouse doors. And as educators, we cannot do that by ourselves. We need mental health professionals to help us deal with those challenges that our students are bringing to us. So those are the three things that they identified, our educators identified, that are most important to be able to attract and retain educators.
We are at the end of our time. We haven't talked about the role of parents in education. We haven't talked about don't say gay. We don't book burning, whatever you want to call it. You've touched a little bit on school safety. We want to talk about, will you come back in a month or so and do another program with us? I'd love to have you.
I absolutely will.
Because we got so many things to talk about. Hey, let me ask you this question. Your experience, you spent time in the classroom. You're very accomplished. What's the most important lesson you've learned for yourself as you've traveled through life so far?
That it is our collective responsibility The adults in this world have got to demonstrate that they are worthy of our students. And to do that, Dennis, everyone has a responsibility to ensure that every student has what they need and they deserve. And part of that includes not just the resources and access and opportunity, but also it includes respecting them as the humans they are, giving them space for their own agency so they can grow and thrive, and ensuring that they know they are loved and supported, respected, and nurtured.
Great conversation. We'll do it again soon, I hope. Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for all of the teachers all over the country. They really are heroes. They really are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis.
See you soon. This is America and the World is made possible by the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., the Republic of Uzbekistan, the Sultanate of Oman, the Kingdom of Morocco, 21st Century Citizenship, the Frank Islam and Debbie Dreisman Foundation, the Forerunner Foundation, the Rotondaro Family Trust, and the Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy.